if a person doesn't want to take an adult position in their relationship with their body, then they are going to be a perfect target for the medical industry and many other industries. You know, you don't need a lot of brain power to look at television and see them spraying with crop dusters and see people wearing hazmat suits to spray shit on food, to ask yourself, well, if they've got to protect themselves from the chemicals they're spraying on the food, why should I be eating it? I mean, if you have two brain cells holding hands, you should be smart enough to go, that's not a good idea. But people do it without even thinking about it. Okay? Yeah. So, in a nutshell, stop bullshitting yourself and participate in your own life, or it will be taken from you at great expense.
Welcome to the Radical Health Rebel podcast with your host, Lee Brandon. If you enjoy the podcast, please leave a 5-star rating and a warm review. And now, here is Lee, the Radical Health Rebel, with this week's podcast.
Paul Chek, welcome to the Radical Health Rebel podcast. How are you?
Better than most, I'm sure. Thank you.
Excellent. So today's episode is entitled Introducing Paul Chek and the Last 4 Doctors You'll Ever Need. Over the last 30 years or so, the man who's had probably the biggest influence on the health and fitness industry, and certainly on my own education, is my guest on today's episode. He was the first guy I heard talk about Swiss balls in the mid-1990s, the first guy I heard talk about functional training in the early 2000s, and the first guy I heard talk about shamanism and plant medicines in the mid-2000s, all things that were controversial then, but are now accepted household terms worldwide. A man who I've heard described as the Swiss ball guy, the functional training guy, a cult leader, a nut job, a wizard, a living legend, a genius, and many other descriptions. A man who has split opinion in the world of health, wellness, and fitness, but one who I've found through my own studies with him to be a pioneer, but also someone whose teachings time after time have proven to be effective in the hundreds of people I've helped regain their health and achieve optimal performance. Someone who I regard as my teacher, mentor, colleague, co-author, and friend. So I'm really excited to have you, Paul, on the Radical Health Rebel podcast.
Thank you. It's fun to be here. I always love sharing.
Great stuff. So to kick things off, Paul, what I'd really love for you to do is to share with the Radical Health Rebel audience a little bit about you. Now, I know you've told this story 1,000 times on your own podcast, but a story that I never get tired of hearing. So could you tell us about where it all began for you, your childhood, your upbringing, your background, and your career up to the point when you started the CHEK Institute?
Yeah, because that's a long story, so I'll kind of give you the Reader's Digest version. I was born in Los Angeles. My father died when I was 8, but my mother and father had split when I was very young, I think 3. And she met my stepfather, who was a special effects man for Universal Studios and had a degree in agriculture. And they had friends living on Vancouver Island. So over the course of a couple of years, they decided to move us all to Vancouver Island because they really wanted to get out of Los Angeles, and they felt that it was a better place to raise kids. And also, they both had an interest in farming, and particularly in sheep. My mother's a craftsperson, a weaver, a spinner. She knits things. She's a sculptor and a potter and does all sorts of things. So my parents came up with this idea. Well, first we moved from LA to Idaho, and we had a pig farm for 3 years. Then we moved from there to Cottage Grove, Oregon. And so their first step out of LA was Idaho. Then from there, they decided they wanted to move to Vancouver Island. And so they did organize to buy a large farm, which was what's called greenbelt land. In British Columbia, it means it's protected land, that you can't cut the trees down. You have to manage it in a very specific way that's determined by the government. It's called the Homestead Program. So once they landed this 142-acre farm, they moved to Cottage Grove, Oregon with us kids, and we had another sheep farm there, but my father was going around to various breeders who were known to have a high incidence of black sheep because black wool is very rare in its natural state. So my father collected a whole cattle truck full of rams that were known to produce black offspring. So we immigrated to Canada with a whole bunch of sheep in 1972, and then my parents started what's called the Abundance Black Sheep Farm, and we had between 100 and 120 sheep. They bought a woolen factory and outfitted one of our large barns with a woolen factory. We had horses, chickens, pigs, cows, goats. We raised produce and sold produce. We sold firewood. And so it was a fully functional working farm. And my mother became a member of the Self-Realization Fellowship when I was 12, which was a great relief for me because I found Christianity to be very confusing, nonsensical. Nobody could answer my questions. And so as an 8-year-old child, I was worried how adults could believe in such a thing because it didn't make any sense to me. But once my mother joined the Self-Realization Fellowship, which is the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda, it had a huge stabilizing effect on the family, and I could get all my questions answered. And so my life on the farm was very holistic because my mother is a yogi, and she studied holism and practiced holism. There was periods of time where my parents didn't have a lot of money, so we lived pretty much fully off the farm. We slaughtered our own animals, raised our own produce, made our own cheese, milked our own cows, pretty much everything. We could literally live off the land, and we often did. So in that environment, I was involved, as you can imagine, every day in the care of animals and the raising of crops. And I learned a lot about how farming works, how nature works. I was also getting exposed to meditation at an early age and various meditation techniques. When I was 15, my 15th summer, my mother sent me to summer camp with the Self-Realization Fellowship monks here in Los Angeles. And so I really learned a lot there, and I had a really kind of like a big opening experience there. And again, I was able to get every question I could throw at the monks answered, which gave me a great sense of reassurance on many levels. And they were very grounded and loving, unlike anything I'd ever experienced in a Christian church where it was, this is how it is, and if you ask any questions, you should just shut up. Follow our rules exactly, and otherwise you're going to burn in hell kind of story. So I also had a very, very athletic life. I began wrestling in the first grade, and then I just loved all sports, so I played every sport I could. I became a competitive motocross racer when I was 15, ended up getting sponsored by a Honda dealership that allowed me to race because I could have never afforded to race. Motocross is very expensive. So fortunately, I was fast enough that this big dealership wanted to sponsor me. And so I spent a few years racing motocross. I also got heavy into boxing and fought for many years as a boxer, and ultimately ended up on the Army boxing team in the military, and then became the trainer of the Army boxing team. I also raced stock cars very competitively and set 3 track records my first year, which was fun and exciting. I was a drag racer. I built my own engines. When I was 18, I went to trade school for automotive and industrial repair, so I became a qualified mechanic. And so that was one of the ways I kept myself fed in the early years. So what happened is ultimately the economy on Vancouver Island was so poor that I had to figure out how to feed my family because the logging industry crashed at that time and unemployment rates were approaching 20%. So it was just really hard to survive. And I had a child, my son, Paul Jr. was born when I just turned 18. And my parents didn't have any money. Her parents didn't have any money. So I pretty much I left home at 16. So there was no fear of not being able to make it. It was just now I had to take care of two other people. So with the economy as bad as it was and me being an American, I started checking around with friends and found there was a lot of work in Florida. So I flew to Florida and got a job working on a fishing boat. And then the pay was so bad, I ended up taking a job as a marine mechanic. And then I decided to do the testing to join the military just to see what I would qualify for. And I scored so high on mechanical and electrical and related scores. And they told me if you just go to university and get a 2-year degree, you qualify to be a Cobra helicopter pilot or to go to pilot school. But the thought of going to school, because I left school in the 9th grade, so I'd have to get a high school diploma, then get a 2-year degree. And I just had no interest in that whatsoever. And the guy that owned the marina that I worked at was an ex-fighter pilot in Vietnam in the Air Force. And he said, Paul, what you want to do is choose the school that's the longest, because then they're going to have to invest the most money in you, which makes you more valuable when you get out of the military. So knowing that, once I did all the testing, I said to the recruiter, what's the school that would require the military to invest the most money in me that I qualify to go? And he said, you qualify to be the most comprehensive school it's called 68J1P, which is Aircraft Weapons Systems Repair. So it had a 1-year school, electronics school that you had to go to. And guys getting out of the military at that time, this is 1983, with that training, were getting hired by Bell Helicopter starting at $89,000 a year, which back and then that would be like, 160 or more now. Mm. So to me, that sounded like a really good idea. So I went through the training and then I became a paratrooper, ended up at the 82nd Airborne Division. But long story made short, after you go through all this training and you get to your unit, they don't let you do anything. It's all controlled by rank. So here I was just taking access panels off of Cobra helicopters so guys with higher rank could do all the work I spent a year learning how to do. And I come from a background of building my own race car engines, working on, very hopped up motorcycles, building roll cages for my own stock cars. And I had a lot of skill. So I felt like I was reduced to a moron with a Phillips screwdriver in his hand. And so, I was smart enough that before I joined the military, I had exposure to a lot of electronics working on cars, and I didn't really enjoy electronics because it's kind of tedious and tight spaces. But at that time, I wanted to get a career. So I said, well, I'm going to give it a go. But knowing that, I said to myself, I better go somewhere where I have a backup plan. And as a kid, I used to visit friends and they were often watching Wide World of Sports on television. And repeatedly, I saw the Army boxing team, which was very, very competitive in the international boxing community. And so I knew that if I joined the 82nd Airborne Division, I could get to the Army boxing team because that's where it was headquartered, is at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. So I became a paratrooper not only because I wanted to be an elite soldier and see if I had the mettle to be an elite ranked soldier, but because the Army boxing team was there. So sure enough, I got so irritated, I scheduled a tryout for the Army boxing team. The only way you can get on is you got to beat somebody on the team. At that time, we were the 3rd ranked boxing team in the world behind Cuba and Russia. So in other words, it's not easy to get on the Army boxing team. They are definitely many of the best fighters in the world. And in fact, the guy, one of my fellow teammates, Derek Wilson, was the 4th ranked welterweight in the world at the time. So he was one of my sparring partners, just to give you an example. And because I came from a background in boxing and kickboxing, I already knew how to fight. So I got on the Army boxing team, and interestingly, I also wanted to compete in triathlons. So I had been competing in triathlons, and I won the Army triathlon, and then I was being sent to represent the United States Army in the national championships in triathlon in 1986. And my company commander said, you don't have to fight anymore if you don't want to. You can train full time for triathlon because I'm going to bet a lot of money on you and I want you to win. So when I told and I knew I wasn't going to turn pro, even though I was a good fighter, I was too, what's the good word? I was too willing to trade punches because I knew if I could get one good shot on anybody, I'd knocked lots of people out. I had a very, very strong right hand, and anybody that I could get would go down. And so I just knew that from being on the boxing team, there was many guys that were in their 19 and 20, and they were already punch drunk from all the head trauma. I mean, they had slurred speech. They would forget what they were doing. They clearly had brain damage. And so seeing that and knowing my fighting style, I knew if I turned pro, that was probably going to be my future. So I thought going for triathlon was a natural transition, but they didn't want me to do that. They wanted me to stay, and they said, don't go, we'll let you become the trainer, because we still to this day cannot figure out how you can train. We train on the boxing team typically 6 to 7 hours a day, and I trained for triathlon at the same time. So I was actually training about 8 hours a day most days, and these guys could not figure out for the life of them how I could do that. And I was the only guy that could fight as hard in the third round as I did in the first round. So they said, we're going to make you the trainer. And if you want to train for triathlon on your own time, we'll let you do that. So something inside me said that was the right thing to do. And so to make the long story short, the team doctor was an osteopathic physician named Charles Pitluck. And so I actually got a 2-year internship on the boxing team in how to care for sports injuries through a medical doctor's approach, an osteopath's approach. And I implemented massage therapy for the fighters. I just studied it on my own. And I'd learned massage therapy was extremely effective because I was so exhausted from all this training that I just asked my wife if she could please massage me. She had no skill. I bought a bunch of books and we just sort of practiced together. And it enhanced my performance so much it blew my mind. It was literally almost like I was taking steroids or something comparatively. And so I began studying sports massage therapy just by reading books and practicing on the boxers. So I was given charge of taking care of them. I developed all their conditioning programs. I designed all their nutrition programs. I'd studied nutrition from the time I was a child. My mother was very into nutrition. It was, to me, it was an important part of athletic training. So I took over their conditioning, their nutrition, the massage therapy program I developed, and there was 30 fighters, so it was a lot of work. And I managed the gym. So for 2 years, I was very involved in triathlon and boxing, and the gym was full of the Army's best athletes. So after a while, the word got out that I was doing all this good work, helping people heal from injuries. And so athletes from all military sports, from track and field, powerlifting, you name it, the word got out, and people kept coming to me asking me for help. So by the time I got out of the Army, I had already figured, okay, the best thing that I can do is go get my license as a sports massage therapist, because that allows me to mix exercise and clinical massage type therapy, sports massage therapy. So I searched around for where the best sports massage therapy school was in the United States. Turned out to be in Encinitas, California, which I had previously worked in because my summer counselor in Self-Realization Fellowship Summer Camp owned a landscaping business in Carlsbad, which is the city next to Encinitas. So I'd already lived in that area and worked in that area. And so I was like super excited, and San Diego's the triathlon capital of the world. So I was going right into the hotbed of what I love to do. So I graduated from sports massage therapy school. I studied St. John neuromuscular therapy training. I became a holistic health practitioner, which in the state of California is a license that allows you to do anything that's considered holistic. So I can work with mental, emotional people, sports injuries, whatever I want, and I can do anything I want as long as it's using holistic means such as herbs, tinctures, electric therapies, anything that's considered holistic. In other words, I can't use drugs, and I can't do things like chiropractic manipulation. But anyhow, so I did that, and then I got hired by the biggest orthopedic physical therapy clinic in San Diego, which was very large. They had their own surgical center. There was 13 orthopedic and neurosurgeons there. They did their own cadaver dissections. And there was 22 physical therapists and athletic trainers. I was actually the first massage therapist ever in California to be hired by a physical therapy clinic. And the reason I got the job is because the owner had had some very serious knee problems. She'd had 4 surgeries on her knee. And the surgeon told her that if he couldn't get her knee to bend, he was going to have to manipulate it, and it could destroy her knee because she'd already had 2 manipulations under anesthesia. And so I had rehabilitated a guy named Kevin McCary from a bilateral Achilles problem. He was sponsored by Nike as a marathon runner. He was one of the top marathoners in the world, and he was an athletic trainer that worked for her. So he said, you need to go see my friend Paul Chek. And the first day that I treated her, I got 8 degrees more knee flexion than anybody she'd ever worked with in one session, and it blew her mind. And she had a master's degree in physical therapy, and she said, Paul, these techniques you're using, I've never even seen them before. She goes, well, how did you learn this stuff? And so I told her I'm using a combination of Rolfing and active release, and I'm just following what her body's telling me. And so the long and the short of it is I rehabilitated her. I got her knee to bend. The surgeon was so blown away, he wanted to meet me. So she brought me into a meeting, and I met the surgeon, John Beck, and she offered me a job. And so I started there. I worked there for 4 years, and I got to work with some very skilled physical therapists. The senior physical therapist's name was Chris Siegel. She had a master's degree in physical therapy. She was highly trained. And so these guys were like perplexed. How could a guy with a 9th grade education rehabilitate somebody that they couldn't do anything with? And they saw that over and over again. And it was interesting because they kept wanting me to tell them everything I did, but they were very secretive about their techniques and what they did and what they learned in physical therapy school. So I finally just said to them all, I'm going to make a rule from now on. I'm not going to teach you anything unless you teach me something equally valuable. So I made a precedent that we had to have an exchange because it was being very unfair. I was being pushed into the corner, and you're not allowed to know anything, but we can know everything you know. And from that day on, it changed the course of my history because now I was able to learn some of the best physical therapy techniques, joint mobilization, muscle energy techniques, a lot of things that you only learn in physical therapy school. And Chris Siegel had traveled the world learning with the best. So I basically got 4 years of very, very comprehensive learning in physical therapy. I did 5 cadaver dissections through Oregon Health Sciences University and through the surgical center where I worked. And I basically just studied everything I needed to study to help people. I kind of had developed a reputation as the guy you send the people to that nobody knows what to do with. And I had an extremely busy schedule. In fact, I had so much business, I ultimately had to hire 3 more massage therapists just to support me. And I was generating, through my articles and my lectures all over the place, 36% of all the business coming to this clinic, which made me a very valuable asset to the clinic. Ultimately, I ended up starting my own physical therapy clinic with a friend of mine, Steve Clark, who was a highly skilled physical therapist. And we ran that for 3 years. It was called Golden Triangle Rehabilitation, but the insurance industry was screwing us so bad that it got to the point where I was having to see over 20 people a day just to make enough money to keep the doors open. And both of us were very frustrated because we really believed that you needed at least an hour a session to do proper work. So we felt like our ethics were being challenged, but it was kind of like we were under a guillotine. If we didn't see lots of people, we couldn't stay in business. So I said to Steve, I can't practice this way anymore. Why don't we try to sell this clinic So we ultimately did sell it. We each made $100,000. I took the money and started the CHEK Institute. That was 1995. So by then I'd also worked for a chiropractor for just under 2 years, right when I was going through massage school and up until I got hired by Kathy Grace at Sports and Orthopedics. So I had 2 years of training with an osteopath, 2 years working directly with a chiropractor. I owned a physical therapy clinic for 3.5 years. I averaged between $16,000 and $30,000 a year for about the first 16 years of my career, traveling the world, finding the top people on everything I needed to know about, from structural issues, nervous system issues, infant development, gait assessment and correction, Feldenkrais, Alexander, everything that I found to be useful or thought would be useful, or through my studies turned out to be a tool that could be helpful. And so by the time I started the CHEK Institute, I actually had quite a lot of experience. I wrote a chapter, as you know, posture and craniofacial pain. I was asked by one of the top professors at Los Angeles Chiropractic College to contribute to a text called A Chiropractic Approach to Head Pain. So when I was 27, I wrote this very comprehensive chapter, which turned out to be the largest chapter in the book. And I got a lot of, amazing praise from doctors and people that read it, because as you know, it is very comprehensive. And actually looking back, it boggles my mind. I wrote that when I was 27 years old. Because if I wrote it today, I'd be happy with it, But, I was very, very devoted to my studies. I took my studies like I took my athletic training, and, I play to win. So once I started the Institute, I continued my studies traveling around the world, but I had worked with so many elite athletes and professional sports teams by then, and Olympic committees and everything else, that I had a very good sense of what was missing in the conditioning world, what was missing in the nutritional concepts. I saw all the common imbalances, and because I wasn't trained in any professional bias like a physical therapist or a chiropractor, an osteopath, or a doctor, I didn't have any inhibitions about studying all of these fields at once. So I developed a lot of multidisciplinary ways of looking at things, which made me very valuable, for example, for a consultant to professional sports teams, because I could see a lot of things that they didn't even know to look for. And I also went to physician's assistant school and got qualified to give medical injection, and used to do trigger point injections for all the doctors because they could never hit the trigger point. So they signed a petition to the state of California to allow me to enter physician's assistant school. So I've actually done countless numbers of medical injections. And then I took training from a guy named C. Chan Gunn, who is a medical doctor, in dry needling. So instead of using hypodermic needles, which are traumatic, I was able to use acupuncture needles that were a special type using a plunger system. And I could actually treat all these trigger points in areas that are very hard to get to, like the interspinous ligaments, the multifidus, deep structures. And I found I could get just as good a results that way, but I didn't have to traumatize people with a hypodermic needle. I also studied medical exercise therapy with one of the greatest physical therapists in the world. And I also studied Norwegian medical exercise therapy with a guy named Bjorn Svensson. And Ola Grimsby was who I studied medical exercise therapy with. And he had a master's degree program in physical therapy, which is also a Norwegian system. So I took these the medical exercise therapy is very technical. There's mathematical calculations in it. It's not something that's just easy to do. But I mastered it. And so by the time I started the CHEK Institute, I had a lot of clinical experience. I mean, I'd worked with thousands of people, and I'd worked with everybody from airplane crash accidents and car accidents and industrial accidents and the best athletes from many different sports. And I had studied with a lot of people. And actually, interestingly enough, I know you know this, but your listeners might find this interesting. And a lot of people don't know this, by the way, but I'm the guy that developed the concept of the core. Prior to me, what everybody now knows of as core conditioning didn't exist. I actually invented the concept and developed it into what you know it to be today. And Charles Poliquin, who you know was one of the most successful strength coaches in the world, he had trained over 400 Olympic athletes, sent 3 of his conditioning coaches that worked for him to do an internship with me in how to assess core function and rehabilitate the core and develop the core from injured all the way to high performance. So they came, I think they spent a week with me, but they were blown away. They'd never seen anything nearly this technical. And it was actually quite hard for their brains because they weren't used to using goniometers and blood pressure cuffs and measuring. And so, but they got such good results. And Charles actually, in one of his visits to me, said, Paul, you really ought to start an institute, because he said, what you teach is just so radically advanced compared to anything out there that he said, if you didn't study for another 10 or 20 years, you'd still be ahead of the game. So it was actually Charles Poliquin that inspired me to start the CHEK Institute. I had a lot of confidence in what I was doing, but Charles was so famous and so well known around the world and so well traveled that when he told me that what I was doing was that advanced, I took his word for it. And because we had just sold the, what I had done is that where the CHEK Institute began, I'd sold the physical therapy clinic and I started my own private clinic, cash pay. And I was so well known that I was making a very good living just off cash pay. I never had a problem with getting patients. People came to see me from all over the world. So I wasn't just a local guy. I was getting people from everywhere in the world, and Olympic teams and all sorts of stuff, because people like Charles Poliquin would send me all the people that nobody knew what to do with, and all the famous strength coaches on sports teams and everything else. So once Charles suggested that, that's when I started the CHEK Institute in 1995. And then I just began developing the programs that, you know now. Started off with CHEK Level 1, and CHEK Level 1 used to be 9 days. It was CHEK Level 1. I remember. Yeah, it was one. That well. Yeah, it was Exercise Coach Level 1 and Level 2 all at once. But it fried people's minds. I even had doctors and chiropractors breaking down into tears in class and leaving the class because it was so advanced that their minds couldn't handle it. And they were so embarrassed that there was personal trainers and strength coaches that were following me that they felt so ashamed they would leave the class. So I realized I have to break this up into more digestible concepts because I'm losing too many students. But in a nutshell, I know that's a long-winded, it's as short as I can encapsulate all that, but that gets you to the beginning of the CHEK Institute.
Yeah, that's great. And obviously, I know myself, we could talk for another 2 hours and we'd still be halfway through what we could be talking about. But
yes, and another thing I'll throw in there, people don't know, I'm the guy that invented the concept of the adjustable cable machine. That didn't exist before me. A company in New Zealand called FitnessWorks hired me as a consultant and said, we want to use your ideas. So they built a whole line of functional. They were the first ones in the world to build functional exercise equipment. And I consulted for them. And one of the things I taught them to do was make cable columns adjustable. I invented the concept of cables side by side so you could do functional pushing and pulling movements. Then, I built the triple cross concept. So, I have advanced not only the exercise industry, but the healthcare industry in many ways. And that really is also I was one of the few people in the world that lectured in the osteopathic schools and circles, chiropractic. I lectured for years at Los Angeles Chiropractic College and chiropractic conferences. I lectured at medical schools and medical conferences. I lectured in physical therapy schools and conferences. I lectured in massage therapy conferences and schools, personal training and strength coaching. So I traveled the world with Penny for almost 25 years nonstop, not only lecturing in all these different organizations, but the CHEK Institute was developed as a multidisciplinary system so that doctors could come in, physical therapists, anybody, and I would make sure that all the students learned so that a guy like you could say, okay, when do I need a neurologist, or when do I need a Feldenkrais practitioner? And so that was one of the things that made the CHEK Institute very unique, is it was really the first multidisciplinary education system in the world for exercise and healthcare.
I mean, what I absolutely love about the system is, first of all, it's so detailed, and you could say complex. But what I love about the system is that the way that we teach it can be very simple as well.
Yes.
And, you know, in a moment, I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about the 4-doctor model. But I think before we dive into that, can you tell us about the concept of the 1, 2, 3, 4 and why you came up with it, and why it's useful for people to understand if they wish to improve their health?
Well, that came at the same time as the 4-doctor model, and you can thank your buddy Matthew Walden for that. What had happened was, you know, I had a lot of, you know, I had developed, we got to the point where we had like 60 people on staff. I was writing articles in periodicals all over the world, literally 10 at least a month quite often, and various journals. I also designed a number of scientific research studies with people in universities to test different things. And I invented, as you know, calibrated systems for measuring things in the body that had never existed but were absolutely necessary. And I have patents on those things. And by then I had a team of instructors, a core team of instructors, because it had grown so fast and we were teaching all over the world. And several of my instructors and top students came to me saying, Paul, we're having a hard time because by the time we finish doing the assessment, so these are level 4 practitioners, fully qualified, we gather so much information on people and they're so completely screwed up, we don't know where to start. And I heard that a few times, and I you know, so I would give answers to people like, well, you know, you do this, do that. But then Matt Walden came to me, and Matt, as you know, is one of the smartest people there is.
Yeah.
I mean, he's an osteopath, a naturopath, and he's just got a big brain. I mean, just give it to him. He's a smart guy.
He's coming on this podcast in 2 weeks, so people will find out.
Yeah, well, it's good because, you know, Matt's capacity to remember a vast amount of information from a vast number of resources is pretty much, you know, right up there with the smartest people I know, and also to understand it. And he is someone I really respected, but he himself came to me. He was visiting me at the CHEK Institute at that time. I think it was 2005. And he said the same thing, Paul. He says, not only do I have a hard time, even with all my knowledge, knowing what to do, because the evaluations often bring up so much stuff with people, I don't know where to start. And it's people are very, very complex. And so this is about the 4th or 5th time I'd heard this from people I really respected. So I went into meditation and I said to my soul, I need a way to synthesize what I do internally. Because for me, it was a natural process. I had figured this out inside of myself, how to prioritize things. You know, I developed the CHEK totem pole a little later, but I had been doing all this work on the hierarchy of control systems in the body. So I knew, for example, if someone had eye problems, you had to make sure that was way up high on the list, or if they had breathing problems or bite problems. And I did a lot of training with very skilled doctors and therapists in the temporomandibular joint complex, such as Mariano Roccabato. So I had a very good working understanding. I worked with a lot of neurologically damaged patients and studied all over the world in neurological rehabilitation. And even in the Czech Republic, I did advanced training with Vladimir Janda and Karol Levitt, two of the geniuses of the era. And so I went into meditation and I said to my soul, I need help to synthesize the approach that we inherently, intuitively use. And so, interestingly, what happened is I was in meditation in the sauna and just, my soul just said to me, get your notebook and go for a walk. And behind our house at the time, there was about 5 miles of trails out in the kind of in the California hills. And as I was walking, my soul started telling me things, and my soul said, "What's the most important thing you always get clear on first before you design a program for anybody?" And I said, "Well, of course, their dream, goal, or objective, or I don't know, what their target is and how to get them there." So that became number one. Then my soul said, "What is it that you're looking for in an evaluation?" I said, "Well, where they're out of balance." And my soul said, "Well, there's only two forces that create the universe. What are they?" I said, "Well, yin and yang, anabolic and catabolic." So my soul said, "Write that down." And then my soul said, "Well, whenever you design programs for people, it requires them to change the way they live and the way they exercise. So that requires choice." And my soul said, "How many choices are there in any situation?" So I thought about it. I said, "Well, there's only three: the optimal, the suboptimal, and do nothing." My soul said, "Write that down." Then my soul, so I got to that far. Then I was in the gym working out, and my soul said, I was at the end of a program. My soul said, I went into my supply closet where I kept all my courses, which was a lot. And back then it was audio cassettes, this is a long time ago, and CDs. And so my soul directed me to this CD from, I don't know, maybe 1995. It was a course I'd studied on herbology. So my soul told me to listen to it again. And all of a sudden, I'm listening to this while I'm lifting weights. And the teacher of the course says the Romans believed that all ailments came from what they called one of three doctors: Dr. Happiness, Dr. Diet, or Dr. Quiet, meaning that everything that ailed people was either because they were not creating happiness in their life, or they were eating wrong, or they weren't getting enough rest. And so immediately it was like a lightning bolt went off in me, and I said, "Yes, but they're missing the fourth doctor, Dr. Movement," because back then people weren't sedentary. Even washing your clothing would have been a workout on a scrub board. So right away I saw that I could categorize values into these four categories that were absolutely essential for a person's health and well-being. And so then I went out and studied many philosophies, from Kung Fu to religious philosophies to philosophies of living. And I found that not one single philosophy out there had all four doctors. They either had one, two, or three of them, and there's no way you can be balanced as a healthy person. So what came out of this quest to simplify my teachings was, the first thing you got to do is identify a dream. The second thing you got to do is figure out where the imbalances are. The third thing you got to do is find out what they're willing to choose to do based on their motivation, inspiration, and will. And the fourth thing you got to do is identify where the imbalances are within the categories of happiness, movement, diet, and rest. And rest also includes introspection, self-time, spiritual development, inner development. I'd also studied Tai Chi with Master Fong Ha because I saw that people only knew how to work out. They didn't know how to use movement. I'd already studied medical Qigong and got trained in medical Qigong and found it very valuable in my own life. And so I wanted to develop a system of movement that cultivated energy and gave you more anabolic return instead of just constantly draining people, because the Western culture was just completely over the top with, no pain, no gain kind of training. And I saw it ruining athletes left, right, and center. I was forever having to back these down, and I worked with a lot of the top marathoners in the world. Biathlon, Kenny Souza, many times world champion biathlete, was a long-term client of mine. One of my clients, Tom Hunt, ran the 10K in 27:40, which made him one of the top-ranked 10K runners in the world at the time. I think he was fourth or fifth in the world. I worked with, many X-game competitors, football players, you name it. So I was always having to show them how to get rid of all the junk training, because they just had piles of junk training just because they were caught in this, work yourself to death or you'll never become a champion athlete. And I'm like, yeah, you are working yourself to death, and there's no dead champions. So basically, what resulted then was I was able to take this model to my students and show them how to take all this stuff and then using the CHEK totem pole, say, first of all, find out what their dream is, so you know, and how to qualify a dream, so you know they're really going to change when you give them things to do. Then use the totem pole to prioritize your changes, but don't give them more than 4 action items for any of the 4 doctors, which can give you up to 16 possible routes to make change, to balance and heal. And then you got to synthesize that down to no more than 4 primary action items based on what you, the therapist, feel is most important. Looking at their lifestyle, looking at their mental, emotional state, doctor happiness, looking at their movement discrepancies, looking at their diet discrepancies, and looking at their rest discrepancies and their relationship with themselves or inner work. And I limit it to 4 because in my studies of Carl Jung's works, Jung said most people cannot remember or respond to more than 4 items or inputs at a time. And he gave the historical research on numbers and how they affect the psyche. So I realized, okay, I have to limit it to 4 action items or I'm just going to get less results even though I'm giving more. And I started doing the model myself with all my patients and found that by giving them less, I was actually getting better results. And that by giving them key things to do that were doable, they could get successes, and then they got excited and wanted more, where before I used to give them these very comprehensive programs that would overwhelm them, and inevitably it would take longer for them to do them than they had, so people started kind of only doing parts of the programs and things like that. But this model allowed me to get far, far better results. So actually, it was my top instructors and people like Matt that put me in a box and made me synthesize my own system down. And the results of it was it worked even better for me. And so, you know, nobody had ever actually built a way of categorizing the 4 essential functions of a living philosophy in a way that any therapist, because these apply to any branch of medicine across the board. I mean, nobody can escape those 4 sets of values and 4 levels of awareness without, you know, having some kind of pathology in their life. And so that also really helped me bridge the gap between my very technical teachings and the public. So it gave me a much better inroad into the public. I'd already written How to Eat, Move, and Be Healthy, which was published in 2004. But many people found even How to Eat, Move, and Be Healthy. You know, some of my instructors had read it 5 times. In fact, Matt Walden said, Paul, I've read Eat, Move, and Be Healthy 5 times, and I'm still learning every time. He says it's kind of mind-boggling how much information's in that 220-page book. And so then I produced the 4 Doctors book, an ebook, and that really became the kind of not only the philosophical foundation, the spiritual foundation, and the technical foundation for how to evaluate a person. So 1, 2, 3, 4 is 1 love, 2 choices, 3 force. 1 love, 2 forces, 3 choices, 4 doctors. So it was easy to memorize. And then I developed teaching songs for each of the 4 doctors, as you know, because I'd studied Native American and Native cultures all over the world, and I'd also studied the history of language. And I knew that in the past, for thousands of years, the way people learned myths and scriptures was by singing songs about them and dancing them. And that people had the capacity, interestingly, to remember from 30, 40, 50 generations, things like the Hindu scriptures and various things. So I thought, well, this has to be a better way. And so having worked with mantras myself, because the monks gave us mantras to practice, I realized that once you get a mantra inside of you, it actually starts repeating itself. It reverberates inside of you like a jingle. And so I basically wrote a jingle for each of the 4 doctors so that, and one of my first assignments for my patients was to sing each of the 4 doctors' songs 4 times a day. And if that was all the time they had, that was the most important thing to do, because once they memorized that, they had now an internal GPS system to guide them for making decisions and know, when to get to bed, what not to eat, why you don't want to work out too much why you need to work in. And that worked profoundly well. And it got a lot of people, a lot of my patients were really adverse to singing and, things like that. So I helped them realize that if you're too chicken to sing, that means that you're never going to be brave enough to make the changes you need to make to get healthy. So that's the first barrier we've got to work through together. And so I would sing these songs with them, and I had them, go buy some rattles or put some beans in a jar and use them as shakers. And thousands of hours I spent coaching people just singing those songs together, and it made them happy. It actually, and people, started doing it with their kids, and then school teachers that came to training with me started doing it in elementary schools, and people like Elliot Hull started a 4-doctor program in the elementary school he taught at and sent me videos, and the kids loved it and showed them growing their own food. And so it kind of revolutionized a merger of psychology, spirituality, exercise science, diet science, and the science of rest, sleep, and recovery, and inner development all into one system. And I really felt by that time that I had accomplished something significant.
Thanks for watching the Radical Health Rebel YouTube channel. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to share with your friends and family, or share via your social media. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon to receive notifications of new video clips from the podcast. And if you want to watch the full episode, completely ad-free, plus premium content, and join the Radical Health Rebel Patreon community, head on over to the Radical Health Rebel Patreon channel at www.patreon.com/Radical Health Rebel. Thanks again for watching.